Let me be direct with you because that is the only way I know how to operate. What you are watching unfold in the Middle East right now is not peace. It is not a breakthrough. It is not a diplomatic triumph. What you are watching is a military maneuver dressed in the language of diplomacy. And if the world does not recognize it for what it is, the consequences will be severe. In the next several minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what this ceasefire represents from a strategic and national security standpoint, why the 14-day timeline should concern every serious analyst, and what the movement of forces on the ground tells us about what comes next. If you stay with me until the end of this, you will understand this situation at a level that most news coverage will never give you. That is not a promise I make lightly. It is a promise I make because I have spent decades in uniform studying exactly these kinds of moments, and I have seen what happens when the world mistakes a pause for peace. I want to start with something fundamental. In over 4 decades of military service, I have seen ceasefires used as genuine tools of de-escalation, and I have seen them used as tactical instruments to buy time, reposition forces, and set conditions for the next phase of a conflict. The difference between those two things is not always visible from the outside. It requires you to look beyond the press conferences, beyond the handshakes, beyond the carefully worded joint statements, and examine what is actually happening on the ground. When I look at what is happening on the ground right now, I do not see the behavior of parties that are committed to a lasting cessation of hostilities. I see the behavior of commanders who have been given orders to use this window strategically, and that distinction matters enormously for everything that comes after these 14 days expire. Let us begin with the timeline itself, because 14 days is a number that deserves serious scrutiny. From a military planning perspective, 2 weeks is a very specific and very deliberate window. It is not long enough to negotiate a political framework. It is not long enough to establish the kind of confidence-building measures that genuine peace processes require. It is not long enough to resettle displaced populations or restore critical infrastructure. But it is precisely long enough to do several things that military commanders care about deeply. It is long enough to rotate exhausted units out of forward positions and replace them with fresher forces. It is long enough to resupply ammunition stores that have been depleted during weeks of sustained combat operations. It is long enough to repair and refit equipment, to move artillery to new firing positions, to re-establish communications networks that were disrupted during the fighting, and to conduct the kind of detailed reconnaissance that sets the conditions for the next offensive. I have planned operations in this kind of environment. I understand what 14 days means to a military commander, and what it means is opportunity, not restraint. History reinforces this analysis with painful consistency. We have seen short-duration ceasefires used as tactical resets in Lebanon, in Libya, across multiple theaters in the broader Middle East, and further back on the Korean Peninsula. In nearly every case where a ceasefire was agreed to without a credible political framework, without genuine third-party enforcement mechanisms, and without the disarmament or separation of forces, the pause served primarily to benefit the side that needed time most urgently, the side that was overextended, the side that was running low on supplies, the side that needed to reorganize its command structure. That is not cynicism. That is the documented pattern of modern conflict, and it is the lens through which serious analysts must evaluate what we are watching right now. Now, I want to turn to the question of who brokered this agreement and what their actual motivations are, because this is where the strategic picture becomes significantly more complex. When 3 external powers converge on a diplomatic outcome in a region as contested as this one, the first question any serious national security analyst asks is not what they agreed to, but what each of them received in return for agreeing. In geopolitics, convergence among competing interests does not happen by accident. It happens because each party has calculated that the outcome serves their strategic position, at least in the short term. And the short term is exactly what we are dealing with here. The first of these external actors is a Western power with deep economic exposure in the region. Their public position is humanitarian. Their private calculus is not. They have energy contracts, trade routes, and alliance structures that depend on a minimum threshold of regional stability. A full-scale escalation of this conflict would disrupt those interests in ways that their domestic political situation cannot absorb. So they pushed for a pause, not because they believe the pause will lead to peace, but because they need time to restructure their diplomatic and economic positioning before the next phase of the conflict begins. That is a rational calculation from their perspective, but it is not a humanitarian one, and the world should not mistake it for one. Their involvement in this ceasefire is a function of self-interest, and understanding that helps us understand the limits of their commitment to seeing it hold. The second external actor is a regional power that has been providing material support to one of the parties in this conflict for an extended period. This support has not been conducted through official channels that are visible to international monitors. It has been conducted through back channels, through intermediaries, through logistics networks that are deliberately obscured. This is not speculation. This is a pattern of behavior that intelligence analysts and military planners have documented repeatedly in this region over the past several years. What is particularly significant about this actor is that their public endorsement of the ceasefire appears to have had no meaningful effect on their private behavior. Reports from credible sources within the region indicate that weapons transfers have continued through these networks, even as the ceasefire was being announced. That tells you something critical about the nature of this agreement. It tells you that for at least one of the parties involved in brokering it, the ceasefire is a public relations instrument, not a strategic commitment. The supply lines are still running. The war is still being resourced. The pause is being used as cover. Stay with me, because the third external actor is where the strategic calculus becomes genuinely alarming, and what I am about to explain has direct implications for everything that follows over the next 14 days and beyond. The third party is a nation that has been seeking a legitimate pretext to formally expand its involvement in this conflict for months. Their signature on this ceasefire agreement is not a sign of peaceful intent. It is a sign of strategic patience. By positioning themselves as a co-guarantor of the agreement, they have accomplished something very specific. They have given themselves a recognized role on the international stage as a stakeholder in this conflict's resolution. That status is enormously valuable, not because they intend to resolve the conflict, but because it gives them standing to act when the conflict resumes. If and when the ceasefire collapses, and I will address the probability of that collapse directly, this third party will be positioned to characterize their intervention not as aggression, but as a response to the failure of the agreement they helped broker. That is a sophisticated use of diplomatic cover, and it should not be underestimated. Their forces are already positioned. Their planning is already complete. The ceasefire has not slowed their preparations. It has given those preparations legitimacy. I want to spend some time on the ground situation because the strategic picture is ultimately grounded in the physical reality of what is happening in the conflict zone during these 14 days. The reports coming out of the region, and I am referring specifically to accounts from local journalists and community leaders with direct observation, describe a level of military activity that is inconsistent with a genuine stand-down. Heavy vehicles are moving, artillery is being repositioned, drone operations have not ceased. These are not the activities of forces that have been ordered to stand down. These are the activities of forces that have been ordered to prepare. The commanders on the ground understand what this window represents, and they are using it accordingly. The fact that this activity is occurring just outside the formally designated ceasefire zones does not make it any less significant from a military planning standpoint. Boundary lines on a ceasefire map do not constrain the strategic intent of a commander who is preparing for the next phase of operations. The humanitarian dimension of this situation is equally important and is being treated with a level of inattention that I find deeply troubling. The civilian population caught inside this conflict has been subjected to weeks of sustained military operations that have destroyed critical infrastructure across multiple sectors. Hospitals are operating on emergency power. Clean water systems have been compromised. Food supply chains have been disrupted at multiple points, and the displacement of civilian populations has reached a scale that creates its own set of strategic vulnerabilities. A population that is hungry, traumatized, and without access to basic services is not a population that is positioned to resist further radicalization or manipulation. History has shown us repeatedly that humanitarian crises of this kind do not remain contained. They generate secondary effects that compound the instability of the broader environment. The aid that was committed as part of this ceasefire agreement has not arrived in the quantities that were publicly announced. That failure of delivery is not a logistical footnote. It is a strategic data point. When commitments made at the negotiating table are not honored on the ground, it tells you something important about the seriousness of the parties making those commitments. And if you think what I have described so far is serious, I want you to understand that the next phase of this analysis goes considerably deeper. Because what I have outlined up to this point is the external architecture of this situation. What I have not yet addressed is the internal political dynamics within each of the warring factions, the fragility of their respective leadership structures, and why those internal pressures make a ceasefire collapse not just possible, but structurally likely. The internal politics of conflict are often where ceasefires go to die, and in this particular case, the internal pressures on both sides of this conflict are severe. Stay with me, because the next part of this analysis will show you exactly why the most dangerous threat to this ceasefire is not coming from the external actors we have discussed. It is coming from within the organizations that signed it. To understand why this ceasefire is structurally fragile from the inside, you have to understand something about the nature of armed organizations that have been engaged in sustained conflict. They are not monolithic. They do not speak with a single voice. And the leaders who sit across the negotiating table and sign ceasefire agreements do not always have the authority, the institutional control, or the political capital to enforce those agreements on every faction operating under their broader umbrella. This is one of the most consistently underestimated factors in the analysis of Middle Eastern ceasefires, and it is one of the factors that I have watched collapse diplomatic progress more times than I care to count. The signature on a ceasefire document is only as strong as the command and control structure of the organization that produced it. And in this conflict, the command and control structures on both sides are under significant internal stress. Let us begin with the first party to this agreement. Their leadership entered these negotiations under conditions of intense domestic pressure. Their own constituency is not demanding a pause. They are demanding a decisive outcome. Every day that passes without a clear and visible demonstration of strategic success is a day that their political opponents gain traction, gain credibility, and gain the ability to challenge the leadership's authority. That dynamic creates an extraordinarily difficult negotiating environment because the leaders at the table are not simply managing their relationship with the opposing party. They are simultaneously managing their relationship with their own base, and those two management challenges are pulling in opposite directions, extending the ceasefire beyond 14 days, or agreeing to any concession that can be characterized as weakness by domestic opponents, carries political risks that may exceed the risks of resuming hostilities. That is the kind of calculation that makes lasting agreements so difficult to achieve in environments like this one, and it is the kind of calculation that is almost certainly being made right now in the leadership councils of this party. On the other side of this conflict, the situation is different in its specifics, but equally problematic in its implications. Their leadership agreed to this ceasefire under conditions that I would characterize as operational duress. They needed time, they needed to reorganize, they needed to resupply. The ceasefire gave them the window to accomplish those things, and there is every indication that they have been using that window exactly as a military commander would expect. But within their broader organizational structure, there are hardline factions whose ideological commitment to the conflict significantly exceeds their commitment to the leadership's strategic judgment. These factions have weapons, they have fighters. They have demonstrated in the past a willingness to take unilateral action when they believe the leadership is moving in a direction that compromises the fundamental objectives of the organization. A single attack launched by one of these factions, whether sanctioned or unsanctioned by the central leadership, would be sufficient to trigger a response that collapses the ceasefire entirely. And both sides know this. The question is not whether these factions exist. The question is whether the central leadership has the institutional authority to restrain them for the full 14-day duration of this agreement. Based on the historical pattern of behavior of these organizations in previous ceasefire environments, the answer to that question is far from certain. This is what military analysts refer to as the spoiler problem. In any peace process, the parties most committed to continuing the conflict are not the ones sitting at the negotiating table. They are the ones operating in the field, in the shadows, in the networks that exist below the level of formal organizational command. And in this particular conflict, the density of those spoiler elements is exceptionally high. We are not talking about one or two fringe groups. We are talking about a complex ecosystem of armed actors, some of whom have independent funding, independent weapons supplies, and independent command structures that do not answer to the leaders who signed this agreement. Any one of these actors acting on their own initiative or at the direction of an external patron who benefits from the ceasefire's collapse could trigger the chain of events that ends this pause and initiates the next phase of the conflict. The international response to this ceasefire has been, frankly, inadequate. And I say that not as a criticism of any particular government or institution, but as an honest assessment of the gap between what the situation requires and what the international community has been willing to provide. The United Nations issued a statement of welcome, which is the diplomatic equivalent of acknowledging that something happened without committing to do anything about it. The language was careful, measured, and entirely non-binding. The European Union characterized the agreement as a positive step while simultaneously maintaining arms relationships with parties involved in the conflict. I want to be precise here because this is important. There is an inherent contradiction in simultaneously celebrating a ceasefire and continuing to supply weapons to the parties involved in that ceasefire. That contradiction does not go unnoticed by the people on the ground who are living inside this conflict. It communicates something very specific about the seriousness with which the international community views the agreement it is publicly praising. The posture of the United States during this period also warrants careful analysis. Washington has been notably restrained in its public commentary on the ceasefire, which is an unusual posture for a government that has historically been deeply engaged in every significant development in this region. That restraint can be interpreted in several ways. It may reflect a deliberate decision to allow the regional actors and the other external brokers to manage this phase of the process without overt American involvement. It may reflect internal disagreement within the administration about the appropriate level of engagement. Or it may reflect a calculation that the ceasefire is unlikely to hold and that visible American endorsement of a failed agreement carries more political cost than strategic silence. In my experience, when Washington goes quiet on a Middle Eastern crisis, it is rarely because Washington has stopped paying attention. It is because Washington is paying very close attention and has decided that its interests are best served by watching rather than speaking. That posture tells you something about the American assessment of this ceasefire's durability, and it is not a reassuring signal. Now I want to address the broader regional escalation risk, because this is where the strategic stakes of this situation extend far beyond the immediate parties to the conflict. This conflict does not exist in a vacuum. It sits at the intersection of multiple overlapping tensions that have been building in the region for years. There are proxy forces from at least 4 distinct external nations currently operating within or adjacent to the conflict zone. There are unresolved territorial disputes that intersect directly with the ceasefire boundaries. There are ethnic and sectarian divisions that run through the areas where the fighting has been most intense, divisions that do not disappear because a ceasefire agreement has been signed, and that will reassert themselves the moment that agreement breaks down. And there are economic pressures, resource competition, and historical grievances that provide the underlying fuel for every escalation this region has experienced over the past several decades. The ceasefire has done nothing to address any of these underlying conditions. It has paused the most visible manifestation of them, but it has not touched the roots. What concerns me most from a strategic standpoint is the scenario that intelligence analysts describe as cascading escalation. This is not a theoretical construct. This is a historically documented pattern that we have observed in this region and in other theaters of conflict around the world. The scenario unfolds as follows. A single incident occurs. It may be small, it may even be accidental. A unit commander makes a decision under conditions of ambiguity and stress. The other side interprets that decision as a deliberate provocation and responds accordingly. A third party, one of the external actors we have discussed, uses that response as the justification it has been waiting for to launch its own operation. Within a matter of hours, what began as a localized incident has drawn in multiple parties and exceeded the capacity of any single actor to de-escalate. Within 72 hours, the regional architecture has shifted in ways that will take years to address. I have seen versions of this scenario play out. I have studied the after-action analyses of the moments when manageable crises became unmanageable ones. And I can tell you with conviction that the conditions present in this conflict zone right now are among the most conducive to cascading escalation that I have observed in the post-Cold War period. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is that the global capacity to manage a major regional escalation is significantly degraded relative to where it was even a decade ago. The diplomatic relationships between the major powers that would traditionally coordinate a response to a regional crisis are strained by competition across multiple domains. The international institutions that were built specifically to prevent this kind of escalation are operating with reduced authority and reduced effectiveness. Global attention is fragmented across multiple simultaneous crises in ways that limit the bandwidth of any single government or institution to focus the resources necessary to prevent a runaway escalation. We are, in very real terms, more vulnerable to the kind of cascading regional war that this situation could produce than we have been at almost any point in the last 3 decades. That is not alarmism. That is an honest strategic assessment based on the current state of international relations and the documented history of how regional conflicts escalate when the conditions for escalation are present and the mechanisms for de-escalation are weakened. So what does a genuine path away from this look like? because I believe it is important, even in the most serious strategic analysis, to identify what would actually need to happen for a different outcome to be possible. A durable resolution to this conflict requires several things that none of the current parties have demonstrated the political will to provide. It requires a genuine political framework, not a military pause, but an agreed structure for governance, resource sharing, and security arrangements that addresses the legitimate concerns of all parties. That kind of framework takes years to negotiate and requires a level of sustained diplomatic engagement that is difficult to maintain in the current international environment. It requires credible third-party enforcement, meaning international monitors with actual authority and actual resources positioned on the ground in sufficient numbers to deter violations and respond to incidents before they escalate. It requires the separation and eventual disarmament of the most extreme factions on both sides, which is a process that has historically proven to be one of the most difficult elements of any peace process. And it requires the external actors who have been fueling this conflict to make a genuine strategic decision to stop doing so, which means accepting a reduction in their own regional influence as the price of stability. None of these things are impossible. All of them are extraordinarily difficult, and none of the leaders currently engaged in this process have shown the courage or the commitment that achieving them would require.